In those dark rooms, the camera could see nothing until the light came. My name is Luca Moretti. I am 14 years old, and I have lived my whole life in the same 3 rooms on Baxter Street, which is to say, I have lived my whole life in a place that most people in this city have never seen and would not choose to see. I am telling you this not because I want you to feel sorry for me. I am telling you this because a man came to our street last spring with a camera, and he asked me to hold his light, and afterwards, nothing looked quite the same. Not the buildings, not the people inside them, not even the dark itself. The man's name was Jacob Riis, but I am getting ahead of myself. Let me start at the beginning, which is to say, let me start with the night. In our part of the city, night is not like night elsewhere. I know this because I have sometimes run errands as far north as 14th Street, to the houses up there with their clean stoops and their gas lamps burning at the curb, and when the sun goes down in those streets, it goes down properly. The sky turns orange and then purple, and then a deep, settled black, and the stars appear, and you can see them. You can actually see them. On Baxter Street, night arrives differently. It begins in the middle of the afternoon, when the sun drops behind the buildings across the narrow way, and the light disappears from our windows all at once, as if someone put a hand over a candle flame. After that, there is a gray time. Not real dark yet, but not real light either. And then true darkness comes, and with it, the smell. That sounds wrong, I know. But on our street, the dark has a smell. It is the smell of 100 suppers cooking in 100 rooms, all pressed together and traveling through walls that are no thicker than 2 of my fingers laid flat. It is the smell of the privies in the yard below our window, which in summer are so thick with flies that you can hear them buzzing from the 3rd floor. It is the smell of the canal that used to run through this part of the city before they covered it over. Collect Pond, people used to call it, though the pond had been filled in 30 years before I was born, and the ghost of it still rises up through the ground on hot nights, a damp mineral sourness that has no name in any language I know. I do not mean to make it sound like something out of a story. It is simply where I live, where my mother lives, and my sister Rosa, and my grandmother, who we call Nonna Agata, though her real name is longer and more difficult than anyone in this city has ever tried to pronounce correctly. She came from a village in Campania that no longer exists under that name. She does not talk about it. She talks about the vegetables she grew there and the particular way the light fell on the hills in October, and she stops before she says anything more. My father came here from Naples in 1873. He was 22 years old, and he had $11, and he spoke no English at all, which he said was fine, because in the part of the city where he settled, you did not need English. You needed Italian, and some Yiddish, and a willingness to learn which streets were whose and when to be indoors. He worked on the docks, and then in a factory that made shirt collars down on Hester Street, and then one winter, the winter of 1885, when I was 9 years old, he got sick. The kind of sick that starts with a cough and ends with a wet sound in the chest that you try not to hear through the wall at night. He died in February, in the room where all 4 of us still sleep. The landlord raised our rent the following month because there were 5 families waiting for our rooms, and he knew that we had fewer reasons than before to find extra money for moving. My mother took in piecework after that. She sews trouser linings 14 hours a day by the light of a single window that faces another window 4 feet away across an air shaft. When the sun is at the right angle in the afternoon, there is perhaps an hour of real light coming in. The rest of the time she works by a lamp, which costs oil, and she calculates the oil against the trouser linings and decides each evening whether it is worth lighting a second lamp to work another hour or whether the money saved on oil is worth more than the extra linens she could finish. She does this arithmetic in her head without appearing to think about it. Rosa, who is 11, helps her when she is not at school. I run errands. Running errands means different things in different seasons. In summer, it means carrying ice from the ice house on Center Street to the families who can afford it, or delivering laundry bundles for the widow Feigenbaum on the floor above us, who takes in washing from better neighborhoods and sends me with it in a cart she borrowed from her brother-in-law and has never returned. In winter, it means hauling coal from the yard and splitting kindling, and sometimes standing outside the saloon on Worth Street at the right hour to meet men who need messages taken somewhere quickly and don't want to be seen doing it themselves. I do not ask what the messages say. I am 14, and I need the money, and I have learned that the less you know about certain things, the better you sleep. That particular spring, the spring of 1890, I was working mainly for a man named Mr. Benedetto, who ran a small import concern from a ground-floor room on Mulberry Street. He dealt in dried goods, olive oil packed in straw, dried salt cod wrapped in cloth, tins of tomatoes from a factory in New Jersey that printed Italian-language labels on the tins to make them seem like they came from somewhere else. I would collect the orders from the families in our buildings, on Baxter Street, on Mulberry, on Mott, on Crosby, and take them to Mr. Benedetto's room on Saturday mornings, and he would pay me 30 cents for the week. It was not enough. It was never enough. But it was something. I want you to understand what that spring was like before I tell you about the man with the camera, because the spring itself was a particular kind of hard. March had been very cold, colder than February, which was backward. My mother had developed a pain in her right hand that made the piecework slower, and slower meant less money. And the week before Easter, she had asked me to take the silver brooch my father had given her when they were engaged and sell it at the pawn shop on Grand Street. I did this. The pawn shop man gave me 40 cents for it. My mother did not ask how much. I told her 50 cents and gave her the 40 and kept nothing. And I still think about whether I did the right thing, the arithmetic of small deceptions. So that is the spring. That is the ground the story grows from. The night I first met the man with the camera, I was finishing a late errand for Mr. Benedetto. One of the families on Mulberry Bend, a family named Szymanski, Polish Jews who had come over 2 years before, had sent word that they needed a delivery before the Sabbath began at sundown on Friday. It was nearly dark already when I set out with the parcel, and by the time I found their door in the building at the corner of the bend, the narrow courtyard between the buildings had gone completely black. The bend is what people call the place where Mulberry Street curves sharply south of Houston, where the buildings crowd together and the street narrows and the alley behind them is barely wide enough for 2 people to pass. It is where the worst overcrowding is, people say. It is where the worst things happen. I had been there 100 times, and nothing had ever happened to me, but I still moved quickly through the courtyard, feeling with my feet for the boards laid across the mud, holding the parcel against my chest. I was almost at the Szymanski door when I heard a voice. "Boy, can you hold something for me?" I stopped. The voice had come from near the wall to my left, where the gas from the street lamp didn't reach, and there was nothing but shadow. I couldn't see anyone, but I hadn't imagined it. "I won't bite," the voice said. It had an accent I couldn't place. Not Italian, not Yiddish, not the flat, broad sound of the men from uptown. Something European, from further north than I knew. "Who's there?" I said. A figure stepped out from near the wall. In the near darkness, I could see that he was a big man, broad through the shoulders, with a hat pushed back on his head, and he was carrying something large and wooden on a strap over his shoulder. It took me a moment to understand what it was. A camera. Not a small one. A large wooden box with a lens at the front, the kind I had seen in the windows of the photography studios on Broadway when I went up that way on errands. Those cameras sat on three-legged stands in bright rooms with cloth backdrops and signs in the windows promising portraits for 25 cents. This one was being carried through a dark courtyard in Mulberry Bend on a Friday night. "I'm trying to get a photograph," the man said, "of the building, but I need someone to hold the flash apparatus while I manage the camera. My assistant is sick tonight. I'll pay you 10 cents. 10 cents? For holding something? It would take me half a day with Mr. Benedetto to earn 10 cents. "Let me deliver this first," I said, holding up the parcel. He waited. I knocked at the Zhimansky door. It took 3 tries because the family had lived on a higher floor until recently, and I still went to the wrong one first, and handed over the parcel to Mrs. Zhimansky, who pressed 2 pennies into my hand and shut the door quickly because the hallway smelled of the outhouse and she did not want it in her rooms. When I came back, the man was still there. He had set up a tripod in the middle of the courtyard and attached the camera to it, and now he was working with a different device, a shallow pan on a stick, like a torch with a wide, flat head. "What does it do?" I said. "Flash powder," he said. "Magnesium. When I ignite it, there is a very bright light for a fraction of a second. That is what exposes the photograph. The camera sees by that flash." He looked at me steadily. He had a wide face with a large mustache, and eyes that were alert and observant without being unkind. "I need you to hold the pan at about this height," he said, demonstrating, "and face it toward the building. When I say now, you squeeze this handle and the powder ignites. Can you do that?" "Will it hurt?" "It can burn if you hold it wrong. Hold it away from your face. Tilt it slightly forward so the flash goes toward the building, not toward us. And look away when I say now. Do not look directly at the flash. It is very bright." He showed me twice. I practiced the angle. "My name is Jacob Riis," he said. "I write for the newspapers, the Evening Sun." "Luca Moretti," I said. He looked at me for a moment as if he was noting something down in his head, which I would later learn was something he did constantly, instinctively, the way some men count change or check the time. "Do you live near here, Luca?" "Baxter Street." "How long?" "All my life." He nodded. He looked at the building in front of us, 4 stories, brick that had gone black with years of soot, windows where lamplight showed through dirty glass, a washing line strung between the second floor and the wall opposite from which someone's gray shirt hung motionless in the still air. "All right," he said. "Hold it steady. Look away. And when I say now—" "I squeeze," I said. "Exactly." He went to the camera. He removed a cap from the lens. "Now," he said. I squeezed the handle and turned my face away, and the world went white. Not white, exactly. What it was, and this is the only way I can describe it, was as if someone had taken all the light that belonged in a day and compressed it into a single half-second. I felt it on the side of my face that was turned toward the building, hot and brilliant, and I felt it in my eyes even though I had looked away, a red-orange brightness pressing through my closed lids. Then it was gone, and the courtyard was dark again, and there was a smell of something chemical and sulfurous in the air, and Mr. Riis was saying quietly, "Good, very good." I opened my eyes. The courtyard looked, if anything, darker than it had before, the way a room looks darker when you come in from sunshine. The building was still there, the washing still hung, but for that half-second, the camera had seen it in a light that no one standing in that courtyard at night had ever seen before. "Can I see?" I said. "The photograph?" He shook his head. "Not tonight. The plate has to be developed. It takes a day or 2, but you can—" He stopped. He seemed to be deciding something. "Come on Sunday," he said. "I'll be back here on Sunday, and I'll have prints from tonight." I said I would. I didn't know if I believed him or if I was just saying it to be polite, the way you do when adults make offers they don't intend to keep. But he handed me 10 cents, and then he handed me 10 more. "For coming back Sunday," he said. I went home and lay in the dark and thought about the flash. In the room beside mine, the front room where my mother worked, I could hear the sound of her still sewing by the lamp, the small pull and push of the needle through cloth. Rosa was already asleep. Nonna Agata had said her prayers at the window facing the air shaft, as she did every night, as if God lived in the air shaft, which perhaps in her understanding he did. I lay on my back and looked at the ceiling, and I thought about that half second of white, and what the camera had seen, and whether the building would look different in a photograph than it looked from inside. I thought it probably would. He was there on Sunday. I almost didn't go. Saturday had been a long day. There was a new family moving into the room 2 floors above ours, and the whole building had been in commotion. People carrying things up and down the stairs, children crying, the usual noise of people arriving somewhere they had not chosen to arrive. In the evening, a man I didn't recognize had knocked at our door looking for the Ferraros, who had lived in our room before us. And he stood in our doorway for a long moment, even after my mother told him the Ferraros were gone, as if he expected that to change. By Sunday morning, I was tired, and the idea of going back to Mulberry Bend seemed less certain than it had on Friday night. I lay in bed and listened to my mother starting the cook stove, the clank of the iron lid, the striking of the match. Rosa was talking in her sleep, something about a cat. Nonna Agata was already at the window saying her prayers. Then I thought of the 20 cents, and I got up. Mr. Riis was at the corner of the bend, with a leather satchel over his shoulder, and the camera in its wooden case on the ground beside him. He had brought another man with him, someone he introduced as Henry, I never learned his last name, who worked as a photographer by trade and had developed the plates from Friday night. Henry was younger than Mr. Riis, with ink-stained fingers and a quiet, self-contained manner. He barely looked at me, not out of rudeness, I thought, but simply because he was already somewhere else in his head, already working on whatever came next. Mr. Riis opened the satchel and handed me a print. I looked at it for a long time. It was the courtyard. Our courtyard, the one I had been standing in on Friday night. But it looked different. It looked like something you would see in a newspaper, the kind of newspaper picture you look at from a distance and think must be from somewhere far away, some other city, some other country. There was the building, 4 stories of dark brick, the washing line, the windows. And in the windows, this was the part that stopped me, you could see the shadows of people inside. The flash had been bright enough to show through the glass, and the people caught in the middle of their Friday evenings were visible as shapes, as silhouettes, pressed against the glow. They didn't know they were being photographed. They were just living. And now, they were on paper. "This is us," I said. I don't know why I said it that way. This is us. But it was the first thing that came into my head. Not, "This is our building," or "This is Mulberry Bend." This is us. Mr. Riis looked at the print over my shoulder. "Yes," he said. "What will you do with it?" "Put it in my book," he said, "and the newspaper, if they'll have it. I'm writing about how people live in this part of the city, the tenements, the overcrowding, the conditions." He paused. "I want people in the rest of the city to see it. People who don't come here. People who don't know." I thought about this. There was something in it that felt right, and something that felt uncomfortable. And I was 14 and didn't have the words for either thing. I handed the print back to him. "Will you come tonight?" he said. "I want to go further into the bend, into some of the rooms. It's easier with someone who knows the buildings." "I know them," I said. 10 cents an hour," he said. I went home and told my mother I had an errand. She was bent over her piecework, and she said all right without looking up. I thought about telling her more, and I decided not to. There was something about it that I wanted to hold a little longer before it became a thing that other people knew. We started at 7 o'clock, when it was dark enough for the flash to show its full effect, but not so late that the older residents had gone to sleep. Mr. Riis moved through the streets with the camera in its case and the flash apparatus in a canvas bag and a notebook in his breast pocket, and Henry carried the extra plates and the chemicals in a separate bag. I walked ahead of them. The first building we entered was the one on the east side of the bend, a 5-story brick structure that had been a rooming house and was now something else, something that had no clean name, but meant that a single family of 4 might occupy one room 12 feet by 10, and that room might share a hallway and a privy with 6 other families, and that the hallway might also be where the Caruso family's eldest son slept because there was no room for him inside with the rest. I knew this building because the Caruso family was distantly known to us. Mrs. Caruso and my mother sometimes exchanged words in the stairwell of the building next door, where Mrs. Caruso had a sister-in-law. The Carusos had come from Calabria 4 years ago, all 7 of them, the parents and 5 children, the eldest of whom was my age. His name was Matteo, and he was the one sleeping in the hallway. When we pushed open the door of the building and went into the dark corridor, Matteo was there, curled on a pile of rags in the corner near the stairs, a thin wool blanket over him. He was awake. I don't think he slept much. The hallway was not quiet. Above us, through the floorboards and through walls that were barely walls at all, you could hear everything. A baby crying, a man coughing the long, bad cough that went on and on, 2 women arguing in Yiddish, the creak of someone walking from one side of a small room to the other side of the same small room. Matteo looked up when we came in. He looked at Mr. Riis and then at me. "It's all right," I said in Italian. "He's a journalist. He's writing about the buildings." Matteo looked at the camera with the careful expression of someone assessing whether a thing is a threat. Then he looked back at me. "Writing what?" "About how people live here. He wants people to know." Matteo thought about this. He was a serious boy, quieter than me, with the particular stillness of someone who has learned that drawing attention to yourself in a hallway at night is not always wise. Mr. Riis said, in a careful Italian that was not very good, but was better than I expected, "I'd like to take your photograph, if you're willing. You don't have to." Matteo said nothing for a moment. Then he sat up straighter against the wall and pushed his hair out of his face. He was not doing it to pose. I think he just didn't want to be photographed looking undone. Even at 14, in a hallway that smelled of damp and old meals in the privy 2 floors below, he wanted to look like himself. I held the flash apparatus. I looked away. The world went white. Matteo flinched even though I had warned him. The flash was louder than you expected too, a sharp crack like a small gun, and it filled the hallway completely. For that half second, the hallway was as bright as noon in July. I could see the dark stripe on the wall where the plaster had gone soft and begun to run, the water stain on the ceiling above us spreading brown from a leak in the roof, the pile of rags Matteo slept on, the fold of the blanket, the shape of his shoulder. Then dark again. "Thank you," Mr. Riis said. Matteo said nothing. He lay back down and pulled the blanket up and turned toward the wall. We moved on. We went further up. On the 2nd floor, a door was open, and a woman was sitting at a table in the lamplight, bent over a pile of cloth, her fingers moving with a regularity that was almost mechanical. She did not look up when we stopped in the doorway. She didn't hear us over the sound of her own work and the sounds coming from everywhere else in the building. I recognized her. Her name was Mrs. Pavlovska, and she made button loops. She sat at that table 12, sometimes 14 hours a day, and her fingers attached loops of thread to the edges of jacket fronts at a rate that I once heard her say was 2 gross an hour when she was working well. 2 gross is 288. I had once tried to imagine doing the same movement 288 times in 60 minutes and stopped almost immediately because my mind refused to hold the number. She was paid by the gross. I don't remember exactly what the rate was, but I know that at Christmas she had brought a bag of hard candies to the landing to share with the neighbors' children, and the bag had cost her what she earned in a full morning. She had stood in the doorway and held the bag out and watched the children take the sweets with the expression of someone who has calculated exactly what the gesture costs and decided it is worth it. I said her name quietly. She looked up. I explained, briefly, in the mixture of Italian and Yiddish and gestures that served as our neighborhood's common language. She looked at Mr. Riis and then at the camera for a long moment, and then she looked back at her work. "Photograph if you want," she said. "I have to keep working." She went back to her buttons. Mr. Riis sat up carefully in the doorway, finding the angle. He was very particular about the angles. He would stand in a doorway for several minutes, moving slightly left and slightly right, tilting his head before he was satisfied. He told me once that he was thinking about what he wanted the viewer of the photograph to understand, not just to see. Those were two different things, he said. Henry loaded a fresh plate. I positioned the flash. I looked away. The world went white. Mrs. Pavlovska did not flinch. She did not stop moving. In the photograph, which I would see days later, another print produced by Henry in his workroom on Park Row, her hands were a slight blur, the only blurred thing in the image, because she had not stopped moving for the fraction of a second that the flash exposed the plate. Everything else was sharp: the table, the lamp, the pile of cloth, the window behind her with its square of dark glass. But her hands were a blur. I thought about that for a long time afterward. The camera had seen the room perfectly. The camera had failed to see her work because her work did not stop, and the flash was not long enough to catch something that would not be still. We went into 7 buildings that night. I will not describe all of them in equal detail because they were not all different. That was part of what I understood by the end of the night: the sameness. Building after building, the same low ceilings, the same narrow stairs, the same wallpaper or lack of it, the same smell of cooked onions and damp and too many people in too little space. The same arrangement: a front room, a back room, a windowless inner room sometimes. Families distributed across these rooms in ways that varied mainly in how many people were pressed into how small a space. In one room on the 4th floor of a building on Baxter, my own street, a building I passed every single day of my life, there were 11 people. A family of 6 and the husband's widowed sister and her 4 children. The room was perhaps 14 feet long by 12 feet wide. I did not measure it, but I know what 14 feet looks like because it is how long our own room is, the one my mother and Rosa and Nona and I share. 11 people in a room that size, with a small cook stove in the corner and a bed that 2 of the smallest children shared, and the rest sleeping on the floor on mats or on folded coats. The woman who came to the door when I knocked was perhaps 30, though she looked older. She wore a dress that had been mended so many times along the hem that the mending was itself part of the fabric now, a different shade from the original cloth. She looked at Mr. Riis with the careful expression that people in our buildings wore when strangers knocked. Not hostile, not welcoming, just a kind of held-back watchfulness that assessed whether this person was a problem and how large a problem. I spoke to her in Italian. She was from Palermo, it turned out, and she and my mother had a mutual acquaintance. The world in our neighborhood was sometimes smaller than seemed possible, given how many thousands of people were packed into it. I explained what Mr. Riis wanted. She stepped back from the door without a word, which was her way of saying yes. Inside, the 11 people arranged themselves the way people do when someone is about to take a photograph. They went still, and they looked at the camera, and they tried to look like the best version of themselves. The smallest children pressed against the adults. The older children stood straight. The men, two of them, the husband and his brother-in-law, took positions at the back of the frame, standing, because there was only one chair and it seemed right that the women and children should have it. No one smiled. This was not because they were unhappy, or not only because of that. It was because in those years, holding still for a photograph meant holding everything still. Your face, your expression, the set of your jaw. And when you held your face still for a long moment, the expression that settled was usually something serious, a kind of dignity. They were being looked at and they knew it, and they were looking back. Mr. Riis stood behind the camera for a long time before he opened the shutter. He was waiting for something, though I didn't know what. Later, he told me he was waiting until everyone had stopped performing stillness and had simply become still. When the pose collapsed back into the person. That was when he wanted the flash. "Now," he said. I looked away. The world went white. In the photograph, I did see this one because Mr. Riis gave me a copy later, a small print on thin paper. The woman from Palermo is standing in the center of the frame, and her expression is one I have never been able to describe properly. It is not grief exactly. It is not endurance exactly. It is something between them that has no word in Italian or English that I know. Her hands are folded at her waist, and she is looking directly at the lens, and whatever she felt about being seen and looked at and documented by a stranger with a camera in her home at night, she is meeting it straight on. I kept that photograph for many years. We finished at midnight. I walked home alone on Baxter Street, which was never completely quiet because in our building there was always someone awake. A baby, a cougher, the man on the top floor who worked the night shift at a bakery on Grand Street and came home at 2 in the morning smelling of yeast and hot ovens. The gas lamp at the corner of Baxter and Worth threw its small pool of orange light onto the pavement, and beyond it, the street was dark. I stood at the corner for a moment. I looked at the buildings the way the camera might look at them, the way the flash would reveal them. The black brick, the unlit windows, the washing lines strung between them, the alley behind that I knew, but that someone else would not be able to see from here at all. I thought about the photograph of the courtyard on Mulberry Bend, the building that I passed every day, made into something else by being seen from the outside. I went up to our rooms. My mother had left the lamp on a low flame for me. I turned it out and lay down in the dark, and I thought about Mrs. Pavlovska's hands, blurred in the photograph, still moving. By 10 o'clock one night in late March, Mr. Riis wanted to go to the lodging houses. I knew what the lodging houses were. Every child on our street knew what they were. The lodging houses were where men went when they had nothing left, when the job was gone and the rent was gone and the family was gone or had never existed or existed somewhere else in another country, and they paid 5 cents a night for a place on the floor or 7 cents for a shelf along the wall, which was a board about 2 feet wide on which you could lie on your side if you didn't mind your feet hanging off the end. The lodging houses were the fact that you thought about when you were one bad month away from them. My mother thought about them. I could tell because of the way she calculated things. The oil for the lamp, the coal for the stove, the pennies set aside in the tin behind the loose brick near the window. She did not speak about the lodging houses, but the arithmetic she did in her head every evening was addressed to them, was a daily refusal of them. Some of the lodging houses were run by organizations that wanted to help. The Salvation Army had a place not far from us, and the church missions. Others were run by men who understood that 5 cents repeated across 100 desperate men made a reasonable income and required no particular sympathy. Mr. Riis knew the lodging house operators. He had been to these places before, many times. I would learn later that he had spent months making his rounds of the worst quarters of the city, collecting his information and his photographs, building the argument for the book he was writing. He had contacts, permissions, a kind of hard-won understanding with the people who ran these establishments that he would not cause trouble and they would not interfere with his work. The first lodging house we entered that night was on Park Street, in a basement room below a stable. The smell when we went down the steps was extraordinary. Hay, an animal, and unwashed men, and something else beneath all of it, the sweet, rotten smell of people sleeping too close together in air that couldn't move. The ceiling was low enough that Mr. Riis, who was tall, had to angle his head when he came through the door. There were perhaps 40 men in the room. Some of them were asleep already. Others were awake but barely. The particular wakefulness of exhaustion, eyes open but unseeing, the kind of consciousness that is resting but not resting. A few were talking quietly in the corners, though the conversation stopped when we came in. The men in these places were of every kind. There were men who had been here a week, and men who had been here years. There were men who had once had other things, jobs, rooms, wives, a country they could return to, and men who seemed never to have had anything except the series of floors they had slept on. There were men from Ireland, from Germany, from Poland, from Italy, from China, from places I could not have found on a map. There were old men, and men who were young but looked old, aged by something faster than time. I noticed a man near the far wall who was sitting with his knees up and his back against the stone, looking at nothing. He had a good coat, better than the other men around him, a wool coat with brass buttons, one of them missing. It did not fit with the floor he was sitting on. I wondered if he had owned the coat in a previous life, somewhere above ground, or if he had bought it from a pawn shop in the optimistic early days of a decline that had ended here. Mr. Riis went to him and spoke quietly. I couldn't hear what was said. The man in the good coat looked at the camera for a long time and then shook his head, slowly, and went back to looking at nothing. Mr. Riis nodded and moved on. Not everyone says yes. This was something I was learning. And Mr. Riis accepted the no with the same evenness that he accepted the yes, moving to the next thing without argument or persuasion. I thought about that later. He could have pushed. He had a case to make, and the man in the good coat would have made it eloquently, that fall from something to the stone floor of a basement. But he didn't push. A boy who was perhaps 12 sat near the wall, not asleep, watching us with sharp, dark eyes. Mr. Riis noticed him too. He went and crouched down beside the boy, which was something I noticed he did with children. He went to their level. He did not stand above them. He spoke to the boy quietly, and the boy answered, and I could see from the rhythm of the exchange that Mr. Riis was asking questions and writing the answers in his notebook without looking at the notebook, his eyes on the boy's face the whole time. I found out later that the boy was named Pietro and had come from Genoa 6 months before. He was alone. He had come with a man who had told him there was work, good work, and the work had been selling newspapers in the street at 4 a.m, which Pietro did, but the man had also taken most of what Pietro earned as payment for the lodging and the meals and the cost of the passage, which Pietro had not known he would be charged for. He had kept a ledger, this man, written down each deduction in a small notebook that he showed Pietro each week, as if the accounting made it legitimate. After 3 months, the man had disappeared, owing Pietro 2 weeks' share of the paper money, and Pietro had continued selling papers and had ended up here because 5 cents a night was what he could afford. He sold papers still. He woke at 3:30 every morning to collect his bundle from the distribution house on Nassau Street and was at his corner by 4. By 8 o'clock, he had sold enough to eat and pay for the next night's floor. By 10, he had sold enough to put a penny in the tin he kept inside his shirt. The tin held 11 pennies. He had been adding to it for 4 months. Mr. Riis listened to all of this with a stillness that I found striking. He did not look shocked. He did not look pitying, not in the way that some people who came to our neighborhood looked pitying. The ladies from the settlement houses sometimes had that look, a sort of pained concern that made you feel like a problem being studied rather than a person being met. Mr. Riis looked like someone receiving information he needed and treating the person giving it to him as someone whose information mattered and was worth receiving carefully. When he had finished writing, he asked Pietro if he could take his photograph. Pietro looked at the camera and then at me. "He does it," I said in Italian, gesturing at Mr. Riis. "He writes about places like this. He wants people to know." Pietro thought about it for a moment, and then he straightened his back against the wall and pushed his hair back from his forehead, the same instinct that Matteo had had in the hallway of the Bend, the desire to be seen at one's best, even in the worst place. I held the flash. Now, the world went white. In the lodging house photograph, Pietro is very clear. The flash had caught the whitewash of the wall behind him, and the detail of the stone floor and the rows of sleeping figures in the background, blurred because they were on the wrong plane for the camera's focus. But Pietro himself is sharp. His face is turned slightly toward the lens, and he has the expression I had seen on Matteo's face earlier, a careful presentation of himself, not performing happiness or performing misery, presenting himself. "I am here. I exist. This is what I look like." That was what the expression said. I am thinking it through now, and I believe that was it. These were people who had been made invisible by every other mechanism of this city, who existed in the parts of New York that the newspapers and the magazines and the society pages never went, who conducted their lives behind walls that no one looked through, and when a camera appeared, they did the natural human thing, which was to use it, to make sure they were recorded, to say, "I am here." Being seen and being looked at are different things. Mr. Riis told me that, and by the end of that night, I thought I understood it. Being looked at is what happens when you are an object of someone else's attention. You are a problem, a curiosity, a specimen. The people on the charitable visits from uptown looked at us. The inspectors from the city health board looked at us. The police on their rounds looked at us. Being seen is different. Being seen is when someone receives you as a person, when the attention carries recognition alongside the observation. I am not sure Mr. Riis always managed the second thing. He was a reporter with a deadline and a theory he was trying to prove, and sometimes the way he moved through these rooms had more of the first thing in it than he would have wanted. But in his best moments, with Matteo, with Pietro, with the woman from Palermo, he was trying for the second. He was trying to see, not just to look. We went to 2 more lodging houses that night. The second was cleaner and worse in a different way. It was a place run by a man named Hannigan, and the men who slept there paid 7 cents each and were expected to leave by 6 in the morning, and were not permitted to bring anything larger than a small bundle inside. Hannigan kept order. That was what you were paying the extra 2 cents for, Hannigan explained. Order. No fighting, no stealing, no lice, he said, though he said it with the confidence of a man who had stopped checking. The men slept on narrow wooden shelves along the walls, tiered 3 high, so that the men on the top tier were close to the ceiling and the men on the bottom were close to the floor. In the middle of the room there was a stove, and around it a few men who couldn't sleep sat on the floor and stared into the heat. The stove was the only warmth and the only light apart from a single gas jet on the wall near the door, and the men near the stove arranged themselves by some unspoken priority, those who had been there longest, or who were largest, or who had established some other claim I couldn't identify. One of the men near the stove looked up when we came in and said something in German. I didn't speak German, but the tone was clear. What do you want, and why are you here? Mr. Riis answered him in German. A short exchange. The man turned back to the stove. What did you say? I asked quietly. I told him we weren't inspectors, Mr. Riis said. He was worried we were from the city. I thought about that. The city's inspectors came sometimes to check on conditions, on overcrowding, on ventilation, and their visits sometimes led to fines for the operators, and sometimes led to nothing, and occasionally led to a building being condemned, which meant the men sleeping in it had to find somewhere else. To the men in these places, the city was not a protector. The city was a thing that showed up and told you to leave. Mr. Riis set up, and I held the flash and the world went white. Hannigan stood in the corner with his arms folded, watching, as if supervising a minor inconvenience. The third place was the one I had trouble with. It was in an alley off Baxter, behind a building I knew well, the building where the Feigenbaums lived, whose laundry I sometimes carried. There was a door in the side of the building that I had always assumed led to a coal cellar, and it did lead to a coal cellar. But behind the coal cellar, there was another room, lower, reached by 3 stone steps, and in that room there were people sleeping on straw on the floor. Not on shelves, not on mats, on straw, loose straw spread on a stone floor. There were perhaps 20 of them, mostly men, and they were sleeping so close together that when I stepped carefully through the room following Mr. Riis, I had to place my feet precisely to avoid stepping on someone's outstretched arm or foot. The smell was very bad. The room had no window I could see, and the only air came from under the door we had entered by and from a gap near the ceiling where 2 stones had been removed and not replaced, a gap perhaps the width of my hand. Mr. Riis stood in the middle of the room for a while. He was taking notes, though there was nothing to look at but people sleeping on straw. He was counting, I realized. Counting the bodies, writing down the number. "Does anyone run this?" I whispered. "The building owner," he said quietly. "Or someone who pays the building owner. Someone takes the money." "How much?" 3 cents. He looked at the straw on the floor. "Sometimes 2. 2 cents for a stone floor and straw." I stood in the middle of that room, and I felt something that I didn't have a name for then and don't have a perfect name for now. It was not pity exactly. It was something colder and more structural than pity. The feeling of understanding that a thing exists in a system and that the system has logic and that the logic extends beyond this room and beyond this building and beyond this block, and that 2 cents a night is not an accident but is the end point of a long chain of decisions made by people who would never come into this room and smell what it smelled like. I held the flash apparatus and I looked at the room, and I thought about the fact that I passed the building above us every single day of my life and had never known this room existed. The Feigenbaums lived 2 floors above. They did not know this room existed. The Feigenbaums were not rich people. They worked hard and lived carefully and were 1 bad month away from their own calculations. But they did not know that below their building, behind the coal, 20 people were sleeping on straw. "Now," said Mr. Riis. I looked away. I squeezed the handle. The world went white. In that fraction of a second, the room was fully illuminated. The straw on the floor, and the sleeping forms, and the low ceiling, and the stone walls, and the gap near the ceiling where the air came in. And then the dark came back, and the room returned to what it had been, which was invisible. Mr. Riis packed his camera. We walked back out through the coal cellar and into the alley and then onto Baxter Street, which was my street, lit by 1 gas lamp at the corner where I lived. I stood on my own street and did not say anything. After a moment, Mr. Riis put a hand briefly on my shoulder. Not the way adults do when they are being condescending, a pat, but a real pressure, acknowledging something. Then he removed it and picked up his bag. "Tomorrow night?" he said. "Yes," I said. I went inside and climbed the stairs to our floor, and I stood at the window in the front room for a while in the dark, looking down at the street.
the gas lamp at the corner, the cobblestones, a cat crossing from one side to the other with the decisive purposefulness of cats. I thought about the room below the coal cellar and the gap near the ceiling and the straw. I thought about the 20 cents in my pocket, which was what holding the light had earned me, which was 10 times what a night on that straw cost. Then I went to bed.
Three weeks into April, Mr. Riis took me to Bandit's Roost. It was what people called the alley behind Mulberry Street, between Baxter and Broadway, a covered passage barely 6 feet wide, hung with lines of washing, where the buildings on either side rose 4 and 5 stories and blocked nearly all daylight even at noon. I had been past the entrance many times, but rarely inside. Not because I was afraid exactly, but because it was the kind of place that adults in our neighborhood mentioned in a particular tone. A cautionary tone. A tone that said this place is further along the spectrum than the streets you know. This place is a degree more itself. People had lived in this alley for as long as anyone could remember, and for as long as anyone could remember, it had had a reputation. There had been gangs here, and fights, and worse things. The reputation was sometimes exaggerated. I was old enough to know that. And the people who lived in the alley were not all criminals any more than the people on our street were. And the poverty in these alleys was the same poverty that existed everywhere else in this part of the city, just more concentrated, more visible, more itself. But there was something in the air of the alley that was different from the open streets. A compression, a history that was very present. Mr. Riis had been there before. He told me as we turned into the alley that he had visited it several times and had once been threatened by a man who objected to the camera, and he had spoken to that man for 20 minutes until the man allowed himself to be photographed. The man had then asked to see the photograph, and Mr. Riis had promised to bring him a copy and had done so, and after that the man had, in a loose way, served as a kind of guide for Mr. Riis in the alley, letting it be known that the man with the camera was allowed. The man's name was Donnelly. He was standing at the near end of the alley when we arrived, his arms crossed, watching us approach with an expression of minimal welcome. "Riis," he said. "Good evening, Mr. Donnelly." Donnelly looked at me. I did not know him, and he did not know me, but I had the sense that he was making a quick, accurate assessment of what kind of person I was and what my presence meant. He seemed to conclude I was acceptable, or at least not a problem. "You going all the way in?" he said. "To the back, if that's all right." Donnelly said nothing more and stepped aside. We walked to the far end of the alley and back. At the back there was a small courtyard, a square of bare earth perhaps 15 feet across, surrounded by the rear walls of 4 buildings. Washing lines crossed it in both directions overhead. A standpipe in the corner dripped steadily into a puddle that had been there long enough to have its own ecology. Mr. Riis stood in the courtyard and looked up. The buildings on all 4 sides rose above him, and the windows were lit from within, and the shapes of people moved behind the glass. The sky above the courtyard was a small rectangle of dark blue, the color the sky goes just after all the light has left it. "This is the center of it," he said. Not to me exactly, more to himself or to his notebook. I looked around the courtyard. There was a child's shoe near the standpipe, just one, the left shoe, the sole coming loose. There was a plant growing in a tin can on a windowsill on the 2nd floor. I could see it from below, a dark shape of leaves catching the light from inside the room. Someone had planted something and was keeping it alive. I pointed it up to Mr. Riis. He looked at it for a long moment. "Yes," he said. We walked in. The alley was at full occupation that evening. It was a mild night, warm enough that people had come out to stand in the passage and talk, or to sit on the steps of the buildings on either side, or to hang over the railings of the narrow landings above. The washing lines ran between the buildings at every floor, and they were loaded. Sheets and shirts and children's clothes and things I couldn't identify in the dim light, all of it motionless in the still air. Children were running at the far end, a game I couldn't identify by sound alone, something involving a tin can and a great deal of argument. Women were talking in two groups, one on each side of the alley. Irish accents on the left, something Eastern European on the right, Bohemian maybe, or Slovak, the languages of the part of the continent I had no map for. A few men were drinking from a shared bottle, not drunk exactly, but relaxed in the way that men are when the day is over and the bottle is available. When we came in with the camera, the talking stopped. Not completely. People didn't flee or go quiet in panic the way the newspapers sometimes described people in places like this reacting to official attention. But there was a shift in the quality of the air, a collective awareness. "It's all right," Donnelly said from behind us. "He's the newspaper man." That seemed to be enough. The conversations resumed, though at a slightly different pitch, aware of us now, adjusted to our presence. Mr. Riis moved slowly through the alley, and I stayed close behind him with the flash apparatus. He stopped to speak to people as he went, a quick word, an explanation, a question, the notebook appearing and disappearing. Some people turned away when they saw the camera. Others waited, curious or resigned, or with the same instinct I had seen in the lodging houses. He photographed a family sitting on the steps of a building near the middle of the alley. A mother and 3 children, the youngest perhaps 2, sitting on the woman's lap. The woman had a good face, strong and watchful, and she held the baby with the unconscious competence of someone for whom holding a child is as natural as breathing. The other 2 children arranged themselves on either side of her without being told. I held the flash and the world went white, and when I opened my eyes, the woman was already looking down at the baby again, the moment of the photograph already behind her. He photographed a man repairing shoes on a small bench near the wall, a cobbler, working by the light of a candle stub, his tools laid out with great precision on a cloth beside him. The man did not look up when Mr. Riis set up the camera. He looked up only when I said, "Now," and the flash went off. And then he blinked and looked back at his work and said something in a language I didn't recognize, which might have been a curse or might have been an observation about the weather. Halfway down the alley, there was a group of young men, older than me, 17 or 18, leaning against the wall. They had the look of men who occupied space deliberately, who used their bodies to make a statement about territory. One of them had his hat tilted at an angle that was a precise communication, though I couldn't have said exactly what it communicated. They watched us come toward them without moving. Mr. Riis stopped in front of them. "Evening," he said. The one with the tilted hat looked at him without expression. "You're the man who wrote about the Bend," he said. Not a question. "I've written about a good many things," Mr. Riis said. "My cousin told me. He said you put his picture in the paper." "I may have. What's your cousin's name?" The young man told him a name I didn't recognize. Mr. Riis considered. "Could be. I took many photographs down there in February." The young man looked at me, and then at the flash apparatus, and then back at Mr. Riis. "You going to put us in your book?" "If you'll allow me." A look passed between them, all of the young men, a quick consultation without words. Then the one with the tilted hat straightened away from the wall and folded his arms. "Go ahead then." Mr. Riis sat up. He was quicker than he had been in the first weeks. I had become, in a small way, competent. I positioned the flash, checked the angle, looked away. "Now." The world went white. In the photograph, the most famous one from that night, though I didn't know it would be famous then, the group of young men are arranged against the wall of the alley, and the wash lines above them make a kind of canopy, and the darkness behind them is complete. They are looking at the camera, and they are not smiling, and they are not afraid. The one with the tilted hat has his hat at exactly the same angle as before. They are exactly who they are, in exactly the place they are, at exactly this moment. When I saw the photograph later in the book, I was struck by something about their expressions. They were not posing, not performing toughness or menace the way the newspapers sometimes wrote about men in places like this. They were simply there, holding themselves the way they held themselves. The alley had made them in the way that everything you grow up in makes you, and they occupied it with a kind of ease that was also a kind of pride, the particular pride of people who have made a home in a place that the rest of the city considers no place at all. Later that night, when we had come out of the alley and were standing on Mulberry Street, Mr. Riis said something to me that I have thought about many times since. He said, "When I was a boy in Denmark, I lived in a good house. My father was a school teacher. We had enough." He was looking at the street, not at me. When I came to this country, I was 21. I didn't speak English well. I couldn't find work. For a time, it was about 2 years, I lived in places like what we went through tonight. He paused. Not exactly like that, but close enough. I slept in a place on Mulberry Street, not far from here, that had 40 men in a room smaller than the one in the stable. I slept on the floor. I was cold. I had nothing. I waited. And no one looked at me, he said. No one looked at me as if I were a person they needed to account for. I was in the city and invisible. And I thought, I was young enough to think this, that if someone could see me, really see me, things would have to change. Because how could you see something like that and do nothing? He picked up his bag. I'm not sure I was right about that, he said, but I'm still trying. We walked back toward Park Row together for a while until our paths split and I went home to Baxter Street. The lamp was out in our window. My mother had gone to bed. I went in very quietly and lay down on my mat in the dark, and I thought about what he had said, about the young man from Denmark on the floor of a room on Mulberry Street, invisible. I thought about the plant in the tin can on the windowsill in the courtyard, keeping itself alive. In May, I got sick. It was not the bad kind of sick, not the chest sickness that had killed my father, or the typhus that came through our building every few years and took people with it. It was a fever and a sore throat that lasted 10 days and kept me in bed for most of them, which meant I couldn't go with Mr. Riis on his rounds, and I missed the last weeks of the photography work. Being sick in our rooms meant being in the room where everything happened. My mother worked at her table 3 feet from where I lay. Rosa came in from school and sat beside me and read to me from a primer her teacher had let her borrow, very slowly because her English was still developing, sounding out each word with the concentration of someone working on a lock. Nonna Agata brought me broth made from a chicken neck she had obtained from somewhere. She did not explain where, and I did not ask, and sat with me in the evenings and told me stories from Campania in a dialect I only half understood, which was fine because the stories were the kind whose meaning was carried in the telling rather than the plot. I lay in bed and looked at the ceiling and thought about the rooms I had been in with Mr. Riis. The courtyard at the bend, the hallway where Matteo slept, Mrs. Pavlovska's hands moving in the lamplight, the lodging house basement, the room below the coal cellar where 20 people slept on straw. I thought about what those rooms look like from the outside, from the photograph, from the distance that the camera imposed between the person in the room and the person who would eventually look at the image. I thought about being sick in a room on a stone floor with no window. I got better. 10 days and I was up, thin and a little slow, but up. My mother gave me extra bread for 2 days, which I understood was a statement of relief rather than a change in our circumstances. When I was well enough, I went to find Mr. Riis. He had an office on Mulberry Street, not in the tenement district, but further north, near the police headquarters building, because he wrote about crime and civic affairs for the newspapers and spent a great deal of time reporting from there. He was surprised to see me. "You were sick," he said. It was a statement, not a question. "Better now." He looked at me for a moment with the assessing look that I had come to recognize. "The book is nearly finished," he said. "The publisher wants it by September. It'll be out before winter." "What's the title?" He told me. "How the Other Half Lives." He said it as if he was still deciding whether it was the right title, with a slight hesitation in his voice that I noticed but didn't comment on. "The other half," I said. "People uptown. People who don't know." I thought about this. I thought about the way the people in the buildings had presented themselves when the flash went off. Not as the other half of anything, but as whole people leading whole lives in difficult circumstances. The title made the people on our side of the city into a category, a quantity, the other, and I was not sure that was entirely right. But the other half was also what we were, from a certain distance. The half that the first half didn't see. The half that existed on the other side of the fact that this city had two very different ways of being lived in at the same time. I was 14, and he was a journalist who had spent years doing this work, and I didn't say any of this. "There's something I want to show you," he said. He went to a drawer in his desk and took out a collection of prints, loose ones, not mounted. He spread them on the desk. They were the photographs from our nights together. The courtyard at Mulberry Bend, Mateo in the hallway, Mrs. Pavlovska bent over her buttons, hands blurred. The family from Palermo, 11 people in a single room. Pietro in the lodging house. The men in Bandit's Roost. The cobbler with his tools. The mother and her children on the steps. The courtyard at the back of the alley. I went through them slowly. They looked different laid out on a desk in a lit room than they had looked in the dark buildings where they had been made. In the buildings, the flash was immediate and physical. The cracking sound, the white light, the return of dark. On paper, in daylight, the images were still and permanent. The people in them had stopped moving. The rooms had stopped being rooms and had become records. "They're good," I said, because they were. "There's one I want to show you especially," he said. He found it at the bottom of the pile and handed it to me. It was from a night I remembered well, a night in late March when we had gone into the buildings on Mott Street and found, at the top of the building, a small room under the eaves where an old man lived alone. He had been there for 12 years, Mr. Riis told me afterward. 12 years in that room, having arrived from somewhere in Eastern Europe when he was already old, and having never quite managed to find a reason to leave or a means to do so. His name was something that resisted transliteration into the Roman alphabet. Everyone in the building called him the Professor, though it wasn't clear he had been a professor. He had been something, you could tell that. Something that involved books and thinking and precision in language. He had books. He had a great many books for someone living in a room of that size, stacked along the walls, piled on the floor, opened face down on the small table where he ate. Some were in Russian, I thought, or perhaps Polish, with the Cyrillic letters that I had learned to recognize without being able to read. Others were in German and French and English. He was reading when we found him, by the light of a candle, because there was no window on the north side of the room, and the single window on the south faced another brick wall 6 feet away and let in almost no light even in the afternoon. He was not surprised to see us. He looked up from his book when I knocked at his open door and studied Mr. Riis and the camera with an expression of mild philosophical interest, as if we were a problem in logic that he was in the process of working through. Mr. Riis explained. The old man listened carefully, without interrupting, in the way of someone accustomed to receiving information and weighing it. "And these photographs," the old man said, in English that was careful and accented and entirely precise, every word placed where he intended it. "They will make people change things? Improve the conditions?" "I hope so," said Mr. Riis. Said the old man. He looked at the camera with the expression of someone examining evidence. "I am skeptical. I have read a great many things that were intended to change the world. Some of them did. Most of them did not. But," he closed his book carefully, marking his place with a strip of cloth. "Proceed." I held the flash. The room was very small, and the old man was very still, and the books were everywhere, and the candle was still burning on the table because no one had thought to extinguish it. Now, the world went white. In the photograph that Mr. Riis now held out to me, the old man is sitting at his table with his book in front of him and the candle burning beside it, and the walls of books rising on either side. The flash had illuminated everything: the spines of the books, the texture of the old man's coat, the lines of his face, the strip of cloth marking his place. And there was something in his expression that I can only describe as sovereign. He was in his place, among his things, and the camera was a visitor. He was receiving it, not submitting to it. At the bottom of the photograph, Mr. Riis had written in pencil, "In the attic of number 55 Mott Street." "I'm using this one in the book," he said. "I want to write about him, about what he represents." He paused. "About the fact that even here, even in these conditions, there is a life that has its own quality, its own interior." I looked at the photograph. "He didn't think the book would change things," I said. "He's probably right," Mr. Riis said. "Most things don't change from a single book, but some things do. And if not from this one, then from the next one, or the one after." He looked at the photographs spread on his desk. "The important thing is that they're seen, that the photograph exists, that 100 years from now, if someone wants to know what it was like, here, this spring, in these buildings, they can see it. They can know." I thought about that for a while. "What happens to the photographs after the book?" I said. "I keep them, or Henry does. Some go to the newspaper archives." He paused. "Glass plates last a very long time, longer than we do." I thought about the flash, the half-second of absolute white light, the exposure of everything in the frame, and then the return to darkness. It had always seemed to me that the darkness after the flash was the same darkness as before it, that the room was unchanged. But that wasn't right. The plate had changed. The image existed now, had been fixed in the silver of the photographic emulsion, would exist long after the room was gone and the building was gone, and everyone in it had moved on, or died, or been forgotten. "I'm glad I held the light," I said. Mr. Riis looked at me. Something in his expression shifted, not quite a smile, not quite something else. "So am I," he said. The book came out in November of that year. I know the date because Mr. Benedetto had a copy delivered to his office on Mulberry Street. He was one of the few men in our neighborhood who regularly read English-language books, which he did with a dictionary beside him and a pencil in his hand, underlining words he wanted to remember. He called me in one Saturday morning and showed it to me. How the Other Half Lives: Studies Among the Tenements of New York, by Jacob Riis. A blue cover with the title in gold lettering. Inside, the photographs. I sat down at Mr. Benedetto's desk, which was not something he usually permitted, and I went through the book, page by page. The photographs were smaller in the book than the prints I had seen in Henry's workroom. They had been reproduced by a printing process that Mr. Benedetto explained involved making an engraving from the original. Halftone, he said, a word I wrote down. And the halftone process meant that some of the detail was lost, the very fine gradations of gray that distinguished the texture of a brick from the texture of plaster, the specific quality of a face at a certain angle. But the essential thing was there. The people were there. The rooms were there. I recognized some of the images: the courtyard at Mulberry Bend, the lodging houses. I turned the pages until I found Bandit's Roost, and there it was. The young men against the wall, the washing lines above them, the absolute dark behind. The one with the tilted hat at exactly the same angle as before. Mr. Benedetto watched me look through it. "You know this man?" he said. "I helped him," I said. "I held the light." Mr. Benedetto looked at me for a moment, and then said something that I have thought about since. "In that case, some of these photographs are partly yours." I didn't quite believe this. The camera was Mr. Riis's, and the plates were Mr. Riis's, and the writing was Mr. Riis's, and the seeing, the particular way of seeing that organized all of it into an argument, a book, a demand addressed to the half of the city that didn't know. That was Mr. Riis's too. But the light was something else. The light had been what I held. I thought about that. The way a photograph works. The camera receives light, and the light makes the image, and without the light, there is nothing. In those dark courtyards and hallways and lodging house basements, the flash was the only thing that made seeing possible at all. And I had held it. I had pointed it where it needed to go. I had, on the word now, released it. The book caused a sensation, people said. Not in our neighborhood. We were already living it, and sensation was not the word for how it read from the inside. But uptown, in the newspapers, in the reform clubs, in the churches where men and women who lived in brownstones and ate regular meals discussed what was to be done about the tenement conditions. People read it and were shocked. People who had lived their whole lives in this city without knowing that these streets existed read about the streets and were confronted with the arithmetic of what the city actually was. The book got into the hands of a young man named Theodore Roosevelt, who had recently been appointed to the Civil Service Commission and who would become many other things after that. And he wrote to Mr. Riis and said that the book had opened his eyes, and he meant it. Things changed. Not everything, not quickly, but some things. New regulations, inspections that had teeth in them, the beginning of the long argument about what a city owed the people who built it from the bottom. Mulberry Bend itself would be torn down before the decade was out. Columbus Park would be built in its place. The Bend would be gone. But that was later. In the autumn of 1890, the buildings were the same buildings. The Szymanski family was still on Mulberry Bend, now on the third floor, because the family below them had moved on, and the Szymanskis had been able to take the slightly larger room. Mr. Szymanski had found steadier work at a garment factory on Allen Street, and Mrs. Szymanski had started taking in boarders on Fridays, which meant she had a little more each week than she'd had before. Matteo Caruso was still sleeping in his hallway, though he told me later that winter that his father had saved enough for a slightly larger room in a building on Mott Street, and they had been able to put a cot in the main space for him. A cot. His own cot. He said it the way you say something you have wanted for a long time and finally have. Mrs. Pavlovska was still making button loops. She would make button loops for another 8 years until her right hand gave out and could no longer hold the needle with the right tension. After that, she worked in a different capacity, slower work, sitting work, and she got by. The old man in the attic of number 55 Mott Street, I went back to check in November, was still there, still reading by the light of a fresh candle. He looked up when I knocked at his open door. I told him that the book had come out and that his photograph was in it. I see, he said. He did not ask to see the book. And has it changed things? People are talking about it, I said. People talk, he said. He went back to his book. Then he looked up again. Thank you for telling me, he said, and meant it. Pietro, the boy from Genoa who had been in the lodging house, I never saw him again after that night. I don't know what happened to him. That is the truth of these things. You document them, and some threads stay visible, and some disappear into the city's dark. And you can't know which will be which, and the record is always partial, always the fragment of a thing, rather than the thing itself. The Szymanski family was still on Mulberry Bend, now on the third floor, because the family below them had moved on, and the Szymanskis had been able to take the slightly larger room. Mr. Szymanski had found steadier work at a garment factory on Allen Street, and Mrs. Szymanski had started taking in boarders on Fridays, which meant she had a little more each week than she'd had before. Matteo Caruso was still sleeping in his hallway, though he told me later that winter that his father had saved enough for a slightly larger room in a building on Mott Street, and they had been able to put a cot in the main space for him. A cot. His own cot. He said it the way you say something you have wanted for a long time and finally have. Mrs. Pavlovska was still making button loops. She would make button loops for another 8 years until her right hand gave out and could no longer hold the needle with the right tension. After that, she worked in a different capacity, slower work, sitting work, and she got by. The old man in the attic of number 55 Mott Street, I went back to check in November, was still there, still reading by the light of a fresh candle. He looked up when I knocked at his open door. I told him that the book had come out and that his photograph was in it. I see, he said. He did not ask to see the book. And has it changed things? People are talking about it, I said. People talk, he said. He went back to his book. Then he looked up again. Thank you for telling me, he said, and meant it. Pietro, the boy from Genoa who had been in the lodging house, I never saw him again after that night. I don't know what happened to him. That is the truth of these things. You document them, and some threads stay visible, and some disappear into the city's dark. And you can't know which will be which, and the record is always partial, always the fragment of a thing, rather than the thing itself. My mother saw the book eventually. Mr. Benedetto lent it to her. He was one of the few people we knew who did things like that, lend books. And he did it because he understood that books were a form of currency that shouldn't be hoarded. She sat with it at the table in the evening, after the piecework was done, by the light of our single lamp. Her right hand was better by then, rested through the summer, and she'd been working at her usual pace for several weeks. She turned the pages slowly. She looked at each photograph for a long time before she moved on, the way she looked at things when she was genuinely attending to them rather than just seeing them. She stopped at the photograph of the family from Palermo, the woman with her hands folded at her waist, the 11 people in the single room, the expression on the woman's face that I had never been able to describe. I know her, my mother said. The woman on the left. She's Maria Cangiano's cousin, from Palermo. I know, I said. I thought you might know her. I told them you might. My mother looked at the photograph for a while longer. Then she turned the page and kept going. When she got to the end, she closed the book and sat for a while in the lamplight, with her hands flat on the cover. Rosa had fallen asleep over her sewing, her head bent at the angle of someone who went from working to sleeping in a single moment. Nonna Agata was in the back room, already in bed, already talking quietly in her sleep, in the dialect of a village that no longer bore its old name. He saw us, my mother said finally. Not to me exactly, to the closed book or to herself, or to the room. Yes, I said. She was quiet for a moment. Good, she said, and she got up and put the lamp out, and we went to bed. I am no longer a teenager now telling you this. It is 1890 that I am speaking of. That spring, those nights. And many years have passed, and many things have happened to me and to the city and to the world. The Lower East Side changed, slowly and then faster, and some of the buildings came down and new ones went up, and people moved on and other people arrived, and the neighborhood was never finished being itself. I left Baxter Street when I was 19, when I found work at a printing house uptown and could afford a room of my own. One room, for myself, with a window that faced a proper street and a gas jet that I could turn on and off as I pleased. I thought about Mrs. Pavlovska's button loops the first time I turned on that gas jet. I thought about the arithmetic of oil and lamplight and what it cost to see. My mother stayed on Baxter Street for another 12 years until Rosa married and moved to Brooklyn, and there was a room for my mother in Rosa's house where she could live without paying rent. Nonna Agata lived to be 91 and died in the back room on Baxter Street on an afternoon in June, talking in her sleep in the dialect of the village, still tending to something I couldn't follow, but which seemed to matter to her very much. I kept the photographs Mr. Riis gave me. The woman from Palermo with her hands folded at her waist. The old man in the attic with his books. I have them still, in a box under my bed, the paper gone soft at the edges with age. But I have held on to one thing from those weeks with Mr. Riis, one understanding that has stayed with me longer than anything else. It is this. The world is full of dark rooms. Not just the rooms I showed you tonight, the lodging house basements, the airless inner chambers, the alleys where people lived in the unused spaces of the city. I mean the rooms in the mind, the spaces in the society that no one looks at, that persist in darkness because looking is uncomfortable, or because the person with the lamp has somewhere else to be, or because the room does not exist on any map that the people with lamps consult. Someone has to hold the light. It is not always glamorous, this. Holding the light is not the same as taking the photograph. The photographer gets the credit, the book, the name on the cover, the meeting with the future governor. The boy who held the lamp is a footnote, or less than a footnote. I am not mentioned in the book at all, not by name, and I am not sure I expected to be. What I did was simple and physical. I stood in the right place, pointed the flash in the right direction, and on the word now, I released the powder and the world went white. But without that, the plates would have been blank. Without that, the rooms would have stayed dark and the people in them invisible. Without that, Mrs. Pavlovska's hands would have moved their 288 loops an hour in the unrecorded night, and the woman from Palermo would have folded her hands at her waist and stood in her dignity with no one to see it. And Pietro would have sat against the whitewashed wall of the lodging house with his 11 pennies in their tin and his eyes open in the dark. We held the light, all of us in our way. The people who opened their doors, who sat up straighter, who looked directly at the lens, who said, "Go ahead," who let themselves be seen. That is what I have to tell you. The dark is a long thing. It goes on and on, before the photograph and after it, before the book and after it, before all the books and after all of them. But the flash, when it comes, the half-second of absolute white light that the camera requires to see, that is enough. That is enough to make an image that lasts.